Our lifespan for most of human history was short, right? We had 40 years if we were lucky. And 45% of kids, depending on the era of history, died before the age of 5. And when you think about our lives, we get to see our children and our grandchildren grow up. The expectation is if you have a baby, you're going to get to see that baby grow up. That wasn't always the case. So the idea that we get these long lives, we get to see our children grow up, we can expect to see our children grow up. This is a gift of science.
You know, I think we've forgotten a lot of lessons that we've learned over the last 100 years since vaccines were developed. There was a big polio outbreak, devastating. Then we developed the vaccine and we called it cured. We were free of polio. Likewise with measles, mumps, rubella, scarlet fever.
The medicine that has saved more lives than anything else is vaccines. Not insulin, not antibiotics, not medicines for blood pressure. It's vaccines that have saved the most lives. It's really a remarkable contribution to human health.
Funding for this program was provided by Presbyterian Healthcare Services, STC Health, the City of Albuquerque, and Safe Teen New Mexico. Additional funding was provided by these generous underwriters.
It's now possible, for misinformation to appear on your computer screen and for you to quickly share that with 1,000 of your closest friends. That's the basis for misinformation to quickly go viral. We're facing a threat from misinformation itself as a viral epidemic of sorts.
So viruses, many viruses are incredibly contagious. They can suspend in the air. People can cough, sneeze, or touch another surface, which someone else touches, which is then accentuated if those same people board an airplane or a train, cross continents, cross countries, and then before long, you have a virtual explosion of the virus all around the globe.
This is truly an unprecedented situation.
This virus does not discriminate. It attacks everyone.
The coronavirus has changed life as we know it across America.
I want to talk about the fact that if anybody's doubting getting the vaccine, please get the vaccine. This is not a hoax. This is real. It's very dangerous. It comes on quick.
If enough people are immune, then it's hard for the virus to jump from one person to the next. With a virus like measles that is extremely transmissible, you have to have 95 or more % of the people protected, immune, to prevent transmission. Other viruses aren't quite so transmissible. You can get away with a smaller number. Herd immunity is about efficiency, and some of that herd immunity is being contributed by people who have had the disease before, some by people who are who've been vaccinated. But then the number is going to change based on whether, am I wearing a mask? Are you wearing a mask? How far apart are we? Am I singing at church and sending out droplets? All of those things, it's not like there's a magic number, because the people keep moving around in the society and doing different things. And that number's probably different in different places on different days.
If you are engaged with the world just through a search engine, that's going to be a different lens than if you are regularly paying attention to people and institutions and sources that you have put your trust in over time. There is value in well-done professional journalism. There is value in academic research. We know who's putting that information together.
So I have a PhD in microbiology and immunology, and then I did postdoctoral training at University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill in medical and public health microbiology. I am a Christian in my personal belief system, and I'm a scientist. And there's some people who would say, how is that even possible? I believe, for me personally, my science builds and reveals my faith, and my faith reveals my science. And so that, for me, is this perfect synergy of saying, I believe in things that I can't see. I believe in things that I've not yet discovered. I believe in things that are still even only theory, but I work to prove the theory. Now, was I talking about my faith or was I talking about my science? They go hand in hand. One thing that we're really learning so much about right now is called the microbiome. And that is this whole interaction of this microbial world inside our bodies. So bacteria that are naturally occurring, they're inside of our body to keep us healthy. So we have microbes that are part of our natural community. And then we have microbes that are pathogens. And those pathogens are the ones that cause disease. And so vaccines, they come in to play because they are able to then help our bodies combat the pathogens that cause disease in our bodies.
So the vaccine is actually injecting a portion of the pathogen you're trying to prevent without that causing any damage. We can inject just that part. Not capable of causing disease, but it is capable of allowing the immune system to learn and practice on it so that when you actually do see the pathogen, you're prepared.
And we produce antibodies, we produce T cells that are able to recognize that pathogen in the future. So if we get it exposed to it again, the whole immune response will start over again.
Your body is learning. It learns from the vaccine. The immune system practices so that when the actual time arrives, when you're exposed to the real pathogen, it's ready to go, armed and ready for battle. So I don't think it's an overstatement at all to say vaccinations are one of the most important medical advancements in history.
Also joining us today here in Studio 49 in Albuquerque is Dr. Melvina McCabe. And so, Dr. McCabe, with this historic time, we get to a conversation that is quite important and also revealing about the history and the traumas our Native nations have gone through.
In our history, we have had governmental policies that have impacted this distrust from the government. We've had our treaties broken. We've had research, unethical behavior being conducted in research. We've had in the clinical practice, as Shannon mentioned, the sterilization of our Indian women in the 1970s, and this was without their consent, without their knowledge. Our Native peoples know this, but anyone who wants to work with Indian country, they need to be aware of this. Some of the things that I've heard, and I think Shannon mentioned this, is that these vaccines were rushed, so they're afraid that they're not safe. There were strict protocols, strict oversight. There are independent groups that monitor these results and give their opinions on it. And these independent groups are scientists. They're not part necessarily of the Food and Drug Administration. All three of the vaccines, the Pfizer, the Moderna, and the Johnson & Johnson, the J&J vaccine, all of them near 100% effective in reducing severity of disease. And severity is defined in this case as being hospitalized, being intubated, and even death.
On the line with us today is Susan out of Bethel, Alaska, tuned in to KYUK. Thank you for giving us a ring, Susan. You're on air.
I wanted to say that I got the vaccination as soon as I could. And when I have dialogues with others that have not gotten it or don't want to get it or are hesitating, don't let it turn into an argument, but just keep the dialogue open and really listen.
Dr. McCabe, we know how things go in our tribal communities. They're seeing news reports, and the moment something adverse gets reported about vaccines, people are buzzing about it.
The first comment I want to make is that there's lots of misinformation over social media. Before just really accepting that, again, go back to asking your doctors whether or not that kind of information is true.
All right, thank you for that, Dr. McCabe. Also here out of Seattle, Washington is Abigail Eckelhawk. She is the director of the Urban Indian Health Institute and the chief research officer at the Seattle Indian Health Board. And she is Pawnee. Our pleasure to have her here with us.
Out of the people that we surveyed, we found that 75% were willing to get vaccinated. However, simply because they were willing didn't mean that they didn't have hesitancies. We have local, regional, tribal centers who are putting out really good information. Go to where the information for Native people by Native people is.
All right, thank you for that. Plenty more to be said. Visit us online, nativeamericacalling.com.
I think we're done.
Studies have shown that compared to the more traditional forms of media, such as television, radio, newspapers, wire services, which tend to present a positive portrayal of immunizations, more modern forms of social media, such as Twitter and blogs and websites, are more likely to portray an anti-vaccination slant.
When schools went virtual, many of our households now had access to the technology. Many of them did not before that time. And so as students were being issued Chromebooks and other technology, here was another resource for accessing that information available to the rest of the world. We started to see that there were some not so reliable sources of information that were being shared and being passed along from household to household.
Every year, there's about 120 million Americans that get a flu vaccine. If you follow 120 million Americans for several weeks after a flu vaccine, things are going to happen. Those 120 million Americans will get heart attacks, they might be diagnosed with cancer, they may get bitten by a shark or struck by lightning. Most of the time, that has nothing to do with the vaccine, it's merely a coincidence. The rate of those adverse effects are often just the same, if not higher, in people who didn't get the vaccine.
Vaccines help create antibodies to fight diseases.
There are several kinds of vaccines.
Inactivated.
Inactivated vaccines use the killed version of the germ.
Live attenuated.
Use a weakened or attenuated form of the germ.
Toxoid.
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 Create immunity to the parts of the germ that cause a disease.
Subunit.
Recombinant.
Polysaccharide.
And
conjugate.
Give a targeted response to key parts of the germ.
Viral vector.
Viral vector.
Use a modified version
of a different virus
to deliver protection.
Like adenovirus,
which causes the common cold.
Adenovirus is used in some COVID-19 vaccines.
Now, going to the messenger RNA vaccines, which Pfizer and Moderna have, we have had the technology for the messenger RNA since 1990. So we've been working with this technology. The technology itself is not new.
So the science behind the vaccine has been working for 10 to 15 years. And now when we have a global pandemic, we take the science of the last decade and we build a vaccine based on that. And so while warp speed sounds good as a marketing piece, right? It sounds really good. Science never happens at warp speed. Science is always built by the scientists from before, and we take the backbone that was provided by each scientist and we move the field forward.
So we have many, many vaccines because we have many, many diseases. And so as we develop new technology, we see new vaccines. So we have now vaccines against human papillomavirus, which is the first cancer vaccine.
Vaccines protect you.
They are
effective
and safe.
They protect against
hepatitis A,
flu,
Polio, rabies,
measles, mumps, rubella,
rotavirus,
smallpox,
chickenpox,
yellow fever,
diphtheria,
tetanus,
hepatitis B,
human papillomavirus,
whooping cough,
pneumococcal disease,
meningococcal disease,
shingles.
Vaccines save millions of lives.
millions of lives a year.
We have motivations for the information that we seek. At the end of the day, people want to be right. And people want to have a sense that their worldview is one that is validated. So we can be blind to information that really is at odds with what we thought was the way that the world worked.
So a lot of individuals think that they don't need the flu vaccine because they've never had the flu. They probably have had the flu, they just didn't get tested to confirm it. Many people believe they get sick from the flu vaccine. Most flu vaccines, though, are not capable of giving you the flu. And so they probably are infected with something else which they mistakenly believe is flu. And so some people believe, well, if I have to get vaccinated every year, clearly it's not working and I don't need to get it. That's also a false belief.
I served in the Peace Corps in the Gambia, West Africa. I teach now, but I'm actually a practitioner by trade, so I spent 16 years in public health before transitioning to academia. So for a scientist, they would think, why can't you see the connection between COVID-19 deaths and just get vaccinated? It's just that simple, but it's not just that simple, right? It is that sometimes people will risk dying from a disease over the chances of living from something that they know nothing about based on the trauma that they've encountered within a system. I am obviously speaking as a Black woman, but we know that these injustices are not only against African Americans, right? We know that they tend to be absolutely against communities of color in general. We know that they are absolutely perpetuated against communities who are disenfranchised.
So I grew up in a colonia in southern New Mexico near the Texas border. Colonias are unincorporated towns. And so being unincorporated and rural and having a large migrant community means that there's a lot of poverty. My mom would have to drive us 26 miles to El Paso so that we could see our pediatrician, whereas most other people didn't access health care. So I'm a pulmonary critical care physician. I oversee adult medical specialties, which is various medicine-trained specialties, plus neuroscience, which includes neurosurgery. But for myself, growing up in a colonia, The hesitancy has more to do with immigration status and with language barriers. And so the hesitancy isn't about the vaccine per se, it's hesitancy to make yourself known and possibly face things like loss of job or deportation.
So some of the key factors that impact the access are the social determinants of health. We were asked to wash our hands. Well, many of our communities don't have running water. We were asked to physically distance. Many of our communities are living in multi-generational homes, so it's almost impossible to physical distance.
A lot of our Native American communities live on reservations, and they're very limited to transportation to get to testing. And so one of the things that we were able to provide this past year was a mobile unit for testing that actually brought testing to their communities, to their pueblos, to their reservations.
In COVID-19, I think we saw this play out, right? Where certain people, because of where they lived, because of where they worked, were at much higher risk for contracting the disease. People who worked essential jobs, right? And you're more likely to work an essential job if you're African American or if you're a minority. Much greater risk of exposure because you're around people, you have to go to work. Maybe you don't have sick leave. I might be insured, but do I have time to take off work to go to the doctor? Is there a doctor in my neighborhood? We also see residential segregation, and we see, again, more exposure because you're not able to safely isolate because you're living in more crowded housing.
So, in terms of historical trauma, if we think about Black Americans specifically living on plantations, being enslaved, being dehumanized on a regular basis, being raped and beaten and hung in public spares, being drowned, being mutilated. That's our history. That's how we landed here, right? That's how we came to know this country. And then if you think about, fast forward, people say, oh, but slavery was so long ago. If we think about the 60s, if we think about the 70s, if we think about the 80s, if we think about the 90s, if we think about the year 2000, if we think about the year 2021 and how Black Americans are treated within this country. People sometimes think of historical trauma as the retelling of bad stories that happened a long time ago, but that's not it. It is the trauma that occurred that continues to reoccur on a daily basis. When it comes to thinking about health equity and reducing health disparities, it's not just with healthcare, it's with all the systems that people of color, poor people, disenfranchised people encounter every single day.
We're going to have you wait for 15 minutes so we can monitor you for any adverse reaction. So we're going to places like Cimarron, Mora, Springer, Tucumcari, anywhere where they have less access to healthcare. I've been a pharmacist for 20 years, and now we find ourselves in a pandemic where tens of thousands of people are dying, and everybody needs to be vaccinated, which happens to be my specialized skill set. Just so you know, the most common side effect is soreness at the site of injection. So your arm will probably be a little sore tomorrow. That's normal, and I think it's good. So you know that the vaccine's doing what it's supposed to do, and you're getting a reaction.
Okay. Well, you've been real kind. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for getting vaccinated.
When physicians' offices closed during the pandemic, pharmacies didn't close because where else are people going to go? The closest person they can find that's a healthcare provider when everything's shut down is the pharmacist. Everybody lives within 5 miles of a pharmacy, right? So we're accessible and we're knowledgeable.
Coming into the pharmacy profession, we're able to be the middleman between patients and their medications.
And I feel like as a pharmacy, we can do more. I feel like being as a front line in COVID pandemic, we've been doing more than just giving vaccines.
Our lifespan for most of human history was short, right? We had 40 years if we were lucky. That's what's changed for humanity. So, I'm in my 60s. I would not have made it in most of human history, right? And I don't have grandkids, but my sister does. And I can watch those beautiful little ones grow up, and I can know when they're born that I've got a really good chance of getting to see that. So that's new to us, and that's a gift of science.
Okay, and we can just scroll here.
Yeah.
Right.
And then you want to see.
Let's look at the evidence of the effectiveness of vaccines is that I don't know anybody who's ever had measles. I've never seen mumps. I've never seen rubella. That's the challenge of the vaccine arguments, because now disease doesn't happen, and we have to remind people who've never seen the disease that the disease exists, right? We have generations who never knew polio. Now my children's generation is a generation that will never know chickenpox. I think now coronavirus vaccine actually creates this new space of a generation that saw the impact of disease, and then they will see the impact of the vaccine. And that's what I think is the argument that we have to continue to make, that absence is the effectiveness.
We're going to see several big advancements. So we are working on needleless vaccine delivery systems, oral vaccines, vaccinations that can be given on the skin that would not involve a shot into a muscle. We're going to see some really elusive pathogens over the years that have been medical scourges that we have not been able to prevent that may come under the control of a vaccine. And perhaps, hopefully, what many people consider the holy grail of vaccination, an HIV or AIDS vaccine.
So mosaics was an idea that I had where you could weave together different viruses to try to get the most common forms of the virus. And so it got advanced then to 2 large-scale trials, and they're ongoing right now. So it's going to determine if it actually is able to prevent HIV in people.
So the good news is that 2 technologies that were in development have now been proven to be really effective. The mRNA type of vaccines and the adenovirus vector type of vaccines. Now scientists can go back into the labs and test them against viruses and bacteria where there's no vaccine right now.
So one of the things I've been working on over the years is not just on HIV, but trying to get vaccines that might help prevent the next pandemic.
How do I get you, or anybody, willing to roll up your sleeve and take that injection? And how do I convince you that it's worth it? It's worth it because you get years and years and years of protection against some pretty nasty viruses and bacteria, and that's why it's worth it.
So I sure hope that this crisis, that this does transfer beyond just COVID to other diseases, to other vaccines, that this allows us to have higher rates of hepatitis B vaccination, to have higher rates of, childhood immunizations, influenza, across the board. And the same way, I hope that we never forget the pain that the disparity has caused, the obvious shortfall we've had as a society is that, our most vulnerable folks had a much higher death rate. If you can't access just those basic social services, you're going to have a really hard time surviving a healthcare crisis.
So we all now are living in a chaotic world filled with information and with misinformation under many circumstances. Some of the best advice we can offer is to slow down a bit, to take a breath, to recognize that when you are met with a piece of information that seems to be dramatic, that seems to be telling a story that perhaps is too good to be true, that perhaps it is.
And we understand also that even while we might achieve herd immunity, that our lives are not going to be back to the normal that we knew. And this new normal is unknown. Once we have that better understanding, I think that it then will afford us the opportunity to do some meaningful work as tribal communities, and to do the real healing. Because Acoma isn't going anywhere. We've been here over 1,000 years. And if there are these hidden opportunities that result from all this, those are those little bits of lessons learned, I think, where we have a greater value for our lives on this earth and for each other. You know, those are the pieces that will ensure cultural vitality and sustainability 1,000 years from now.
I got vaccinated because I want to make sure my parents who are in their late 80s and live with me stay healthy.
I got vaccinated to protect our community.
I got vaccinated because of my mother. I would never do anything to put her life at risk.
Yo me he vacunado porque me quiero proteger de ser infectada, pero también quiero proteger a mi hija, a mi esposo y a mi comunidad.
I get vaccinated to protect everybody else. When I'm immune, it makes it harder for the virus to jump from person to person.
For every vaccine given, that's a potential life saved.